Well, a learner in 2030, just as much as learners now, or as much as learners will ever need to be embedded in both their local context as well as their global context. So to have a very good understanding of interconnections between the world and their local situation. So to be able to see the interconnected components of our world as systems, as individual systems that they're able to affect, and as broader systems.
Yeah, and business as usual is not going to get us there, presumably.
I don't think so. I really do think that a more effective way perhaps of doing things in today's world and certainly in the future is this more integrated approach to education. So, for example, giving students a problem to solve where they would have to take into consideration not just one or two perspectives, so let's say a mathematical perspective or a perspective from the point of view of English literature, but where they could bring in both and therefore have a richer learning experience.
Okay. This kind of future, it's nice to envisage. The nuts and bolts of it can be quite difficult. So, for instance, if we're talking about these kinds of new skills, what are called 21st century skills like collaboration and creativity, traditional forms of assessment aren't really going to cut it. Would it be fair to say that?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, those kinds of skills are often called soft skills.
Yeah.
So it's something that the students are supposed to have, but that we don't necessarily need to measure. But there's all kinds of literature out there now where it is suggested that you can actually measure things like creativity. Perhaps you can't measure it with an exam, but you can certainly measure it kind of in more milestone type assessments rather than the summative assessments at the end of a year. But there are ways of measuring that kind of activity in learning.
And I think also that new research on assessing those soft skills reflects a changing view that those soft skills can actually be developed. We're going away from that idea that creativity is something that you're born with, or leadership skills are something that you inherently have, and recognizing that we can develop young people that have all of these very, very important skills. We can develop people who are good at collaboration, who are good at creativity, by using the classroom as a tool to develop these students.
Right. And presumably, because in the 21st century we're moving away from the model where knowing a fact is a useful thing, those kinds of assessments which assess and test whether you know a fact and what facts you know, those, again, are just going to become something that's kind of redundant now.
We need to adapt, right? We need to adapt to the influx of information that is at our fingertips. And we also need to realize that there are skills that have not been developed. So instead of, funneling more information into young brains, what skills are we not currently focusing on that we need to develop for the future?
Okay.
And I would add to that there is a whole range of, some are talking about new literacies. So, for example, data literacies or video literacies. So I agree that finding factual information anymore is, anybody can do it, right? You just Google it, but that doesn't mean that it should be neglected. It just needs to be perhaps approached in the future in a different way. Perhaps we shouldn't test that so much and move towards the new literacies in terms of assessment and in terms of teaching. So one example of that would be, let's take data literacy. So we're all bombarded with a huge amount of information. So how will they grasp with this so-called overload of information that everybody always talks about? And there are all kinds of tools out there that can parse information quite effectively, but we will have to know how to use those tools.
Right.
So, and this is just simply something that students didn't need to learn 20 years ago. But, 10 years from now and 20 years from now, they certainly will have to know how to do that.
Right. So with all these innovations and these kind of new pathways, how will the role of the teacher change?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's been really, really rewarding in preparing the blueprint to talk to a lot of teachers and to realize that a lot of our recommendations or discussions that we were having here in our group resonated really quite well with many, many teachers. And the reason why they resonated so well is because a lot of teachers are looking for new ways of new pedagogies and new methodologies. And so the discussion was really quite enriching in that respect. So I think that what a lot of teachers are thinking about is that the traditional role of the teacher perhaps no longer works as well as it used to. So the idea of the teacher passing on information to the student has already changed in a lot of teachers' minds. And so we're hoping that the blueprint will just add to that discussion and hopefully provide teachers with lots more ideas and recommendations as to how to move towards a new system of learning, which will shift more from the teacher as passing on information to the teacher as kind of a curator of information and helping to contextualize information for the students, helping students to effectively learn within their peer groups and with their peers, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And this is a future we're talking about that we're already seeing happen, aren't we? We're not making anything happen that isn't already out there. Absolutely,
but we want to encourage more of what is good and what else and what's happening currently that is moving in a positive direction. So hopefully this blueprint, after being reviewed perhaps by an administrator, will be able to call on those teachers in those schools who are pushing the boundaries, who are doing everything they can to engage their students in a co-learning process. Let's pinpoint, those teachers. Let's see what is it that they're doing and how can we learn from them, because you're absolutely right. This is already happening all around us. When I look to my own, educational history in high school, some of my contributions to this very document in creating the blueprint came from what I remembered as best practices from my own teachers. So this is nothing new that we're trying to introduce, but we really need to shift our focus onto those teachers who are pushing the limits and who are trying to innovate outside of the structures that may have been imposed on them. We need to free teachers to allow them to co-learn with their students and to support their students in the greatest capacity that they can.
So sometimes we think of schools as almost like silos. They're separated out from their communities. They exist within a community, but there are walls, and it's almost like they're impermeable walls. We know that schools don't exist in a vacuum. So what's the future of making that, or really making use of the community that's around the school?
Mm-hmm. I think that the brick and mortar kind of building, in some instances it'll always be there, but it doesn't have to be regarded as, like you were saying, as kind of the separate entity where, the knowledge just stays in there and then everything is different when the students at the end of the day leave. But it should be a much more fluid structure in the sense that resources from the school can also go into the community, and then the wealth of knowledge that exists in a community should also come into the school, so that there is much more interaction between the community and the school, which I think can be very enriching for the teachers and most certainly for the students. So just to kind of open up and make the learning process much more fluid in that sense.
Right.
And I think also make the learning process a lot more relevant to certain communities. So we talk about problem-based learning. Let's pick a problem that your own local community is dealing with. Go out into your community as a school group, engage with the stakeholders, talk to members of your community, get to know them, allow them to get to know you. This is all about community building as well, because the school does not exist in a vacuum. It exists and is contingent on the support of others around it, and can really flourish if it has the support of other people in the community. And there are many people who have knowledge who are not necessarily teachers or educators or those who are directly engaging with young people or whoever the student or the learner may be. So how can we incorporate them? How can we expand that educational ecosystem to incorporate as many people as possible?
So this new kind of learning requires a new kind of assessment. How will things change in terms of assessment? We're not talking about getting rid of assessment, are we? We're talking about assessment that's maybe more fit for purpose.
I think right now when you say assessment, people in the school systems think, oh, obviously tests, exams, sit down, half an hour, 90 minutes, whatever, and fill in this booklet with all that we have taught you. And we're looking to do away with that old model of assessment, but not assessment altogether. We're looking at new and meaningful ways of iterating feedback, allowing the student, the chance to improve, which sounds funny, but they don't really have that when you get your grade at the end of the year. Well, it's too late. This is what you need to improve on. Well, it's too late. You're moving on, or perhaps you're not moving on. And so we need to work in ways that Students are used to giving each other feedback, are more self-reflective and critical of the work that they're doing and the skills that they are building, and then educators who are able to give feedback along the way as well in order to build up the student as they go.
So is it really important that we allow students to move outside of the place where they feel safe? I mean, is that an important skill for them to kind of get used to exercising?
I think it's extremely important that we allow students to go to the boundaries of their learning, to go to the boundaries of their comfort zone, and to take the risks to surpass those boundaries, right? To go beyond that. I don't think that learning happens where you're most comfortable, where you're regurgitating the information that you have learned, quote unquote, so well,
yeah.
right? We need to create a culture that actually allows for feedback to be given, and this ties right back into assessment, to students while they're still in that learning process. It needs to be an iterative feedback loop cycle. We really need that. We really need that to happen to encourage students to go beyond where they're comfortable rather than being constantly afraid of that end goal assessment.
One of the things that I think we identified quite early on in the research is the importance of having networks.
Yes.
So networks for learners, and we talked about them being able to use technology to interact with learners sort of from around the world. But also educators, learning professionals really need to network together, don't they, because some of them have these great ideas, and when you put all those ideas out there in a form that is accessible to everyone, you've got a revolution in waiting almost, haven't you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, teachers in that sense, or all of us really, when we tackle something new, function in exactly the same way as students do. And so it's the sharing of information which through a network becomes exponential. And so for teachers, it's exactly the same. As soon as you have a network, you realize, oh, this person is thinking exactly like me, maybe we can work together on a problem.
And then it becomes even more exciting in a sense, because you're collaborating together. So we're not just talking about student collaboration, but teacher collaboration as well. So all of this has to take place within a structure. So you'll have principals, you'll have school boards, you'll have superintendents, you'll have ministries of education. Sort of wherever you are in the world, there'll be some kind of equivalent structure. How do we see that kind of evolving? Is that it's going to be necessary for it to evolve, presumably?
Yes, it will be necessary to evolve, and what we're seeing right now around the world, with few exceptions, is that those sort of administrative structures are just that, administrative structures, very administrator heavy, a lot of representation from, maybe what in North America we consider to be the school board members, with very little representation, very little voice coming from students or those on the receiving end on the education, rather than being on the receiving end of anything at all. We want to empower students to be at the decision-making table, participating in the education that they are, that they and their peers will be benefiting from. And so we really think that evolution of that structure is going to include a lot more representation from a lot more diverse range of stakeholders in the community.
And they're going to be working together towards something, I think. Sometimes you get the feeling that there are different disparate levels of administration, whatever, and each has its own kind of goals and agenda. But I think what we're trying to do with the blueprint is show that everyone actually has the same goal, and they need to work together in this, I think what we termed ecosystem. So we're all in this, this pond, as it were, with the same kind of goals, and all looking to create these thriving learners. Can this be done?
I'm the ultimate optimist, I think. So yes, I do think it can be done. I think it requires a certain amount of openness from all the stakeholders, not just from the administration, but also from the students. I think the openness from the teachers is largely there.
Yeah.
And at least in our experience, consulting with teacher groups and boards of education and other stakeholders, we have realized that the will is there. I think mostly everybody realizes that we are at the crossroads when it comes to forms of education, and that the type of traditional education that we have now comes from a different historical time period, and it has just simply, it just does not fit the future anymore, as well as it did the past, for all kinds of reasons. So I think as long as the openness is there and the will for a dialogue, yes, I do think it can be done.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience, talking to school boards and ministry people, is that everybody's working towards this already, I think. People have seen that the current system has worked for a while, but it's kind of run its course, and there needs to be a move towards this more fluid kind of learning, more focused on these different kinds of skills and outcomes. One of my questions would be, does this mean it requires an injection of money, or is it going to cost more, or is it actually a shifting of resources?
I think it's more shifting of resources, really. In fact, it might even, in the long run, cost less because, like we were discussing earlier, I mean, peer-to-peer education, for example, might mean that resources will be, this idea of the network, that resources will be coming in much more at a very, very cost-efficient level. So I don't really see where the increase in cost would come from. In some instances, perhaps more personnel would have to be hired. That's definitely a possibility. But where you have an expense, you may be saving in other areas, right? So,
for example, assessment, right? I mean,
like
the amount of money that it takes to run, national, grade level exams that really are not at all contributing to the learner's education whatsoever. They're just sort of, standards indicators for certain governments. By throwing that all out altogether or scaling it back to an appropriate level, there you go. Now you have more money to hire personnel, which is, it's about shifting resources, and it's about a reprioritization, right? So, I mean, there is already a lot of money around the world going into education, and it's just about how can we best use the resources that we have? How can we leverage what we have in places where we may not have any money coming in at all? That doesn't mean that this blueprint that we have all, designed is not applicable somewhere. It's very context specific given the resources that one has.
Right. So we're in this position where we've outlined kind of this future that we think is worth working towards. Is it possible to put forward implementation pathways for how people might get there, or is that very much something that should be done at a local level?
Because it's supposed to be adapted globally. I mean, there are so many different circumstances globally that have to be taken into account. But I do think that we can kind of work in steps, right? And so one of the first steps that we are going to undertake is the living blueprint.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just say a few words about that. So the living blueprint, the idea is that this will be an interactive, not just a static website where people can glean information, but it will be a site where people can contribute. And I think that is very, very important because people will hopefully contribute globally. So we will continue to gain different perspectives, and perhaps from there we'll be able to kind of forge a path that we can then implement in steps.
Yeah. So we're sort of very much recognizing that the blueprint is just the beginning. So,
yes, absolutely.
So we have a document. We are planning to unfreeze that document, as it were. Just we'll put it out there, but actually, what we're really more interested in is the way it evolves and the way it gives other people the opportunity to evolve it. So to put in these exemplar sort of ideas, practices that work well, so that they can be shared and adapted to local context.
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping that it's going to be a very, very dynamic process that's not just going to stop as soon as the blueprint gets published, but quite on the contrary, that's going to start for real at that time. So we are really just kind of the first stepping stone to something much bigger.
Right.
And in places where people may not be talking about institutional innovation with regards to education, we want to start that dialogue, and maybe the blueprint there, it will start that dialogue for those people.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So for a lot of people, there's a recognition, isn't there, that now is the time. And we've seen, people have had innovative ideas in the past, some of which are exactly the same as the ideas, in fact, that we're sharing. This is not new. Some of these, can date back decades, in fact. But would you say there's something about now where this is a good time to actually, where we can pull together the resources to make these implementations happen?
I think so. Like I said earlier, I mean, there really seems to be a movement of recognition that what we have and had is no longer working. And so my assumption is that not only is there great interest in moving this forward, but there seems to be a sense of urgency to change the education system. And I don't just mean in Canada, I really do mean globally. And so the living document, I think, will serve that purpose quite well. So, for example, if they're educators from the same country but in very different circumstances, and for them to be able to communicate and to figure out what it is that they can do together, and they will do that through the living blueprint by sharing information, I think that can really go a long way.
Mm.
I remember, I mean, there is definitely a sense of urgency. And I remember through my K through 12 education being rewarded, along with my peers, for moments when we would show evidence of thinking outside of the box.
Mm.
Why can we not expand, the box that is the classroom that we have right now to encourage students to teach them how to do that kind of thinking, how to be creative, how to be analytical? If those are the ideas that we already know, the ideas that go outside of the box, if we already know that those are the ones that we need to develop, how can we then foster the creation of those ideas? We don't want these to be, peripheral, outlying ideas and solutions for very pressing problems right now. If we don't reform, what we have right now, and we have the resources to do it, but if we don't do something about our education system right now, I think right now we're already inadequate, and by 2030 we're going to be woefully unprepared for the problems that we will be facing.
So if we can do this and get this right, what will we gain?
I think that we will be able to shape learners that are going to be creative and adaptable, adaptable to really, at the end of the day, an uncertain future, and where more complex ways of thinking and of approaching problems will be necessary. And through the blueprint that we have developed, at least for us, we really are convinced that this is one step in the right direction, and that this will be the first stepping stone towards a dynamic dialogue with all the stakeholders to create an education system where we will be able to create those, or we will be able to foster that type of learning.
Right.
And ultimately, we don't know what 2030 is going to look like. We don't know what any of the years of the future are going to look like, but we know we are not currently preparing our students with the skills that they will need to face future issues. And so that's what this blueprint is all about, allowing for that dynamism, allowing for the dialogue, allowing for innovation to happen, so that we do create a new generation of young learners who are adaptable, confident, creative, and ready to face the new world problems.
Right. So it's something that's really worth investing in right now.
It's something that we need to invest in right now. Again, we won't be prepared in the future if we don't. It's something that it's urgent all around the world. Our systems of education have so much good happening within them, but there's a long way that we need to go. So we really need to take this time right now to start learning from best practices and amplify those voices, amplify the voices of the teachers who have been doing amazing things for their entire teaching careers, amplify the voices of the students who currently are really left out of a lot of the discussions that are happening right around them. We need everybody to buy into this project all around the world. Because it's about education, and there's nothing more fundamental, I think, in a person's experience.